is. Hope I didn't just steal a line, Annabel. At any rate, tonight's presentation will be about 35 minutes, followed by a Q&A. The program tonight can be viewed in its native habitat here on Crowdcast, as well as on our Facebook and YouTube pages. To watch with closed captioning, you can go over to YouTube, where you can also enable real-time captions by clicking the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following the broadcast as well. Note, you'll have to submit your questions in the Ask a Question button back on Crowdcast. We cannot guarantee we'll be able to get to every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. So keep them coming in. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Matt Ortile with Ashley Ford talking about the experience of building a life in New York as a gay Filipino immigrant. Aaron Bobrow Strain on the experience of undocumented immigrants in America. Economist Stephanie Kelton on the myth of deficits and building an economy for working people. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. And another installment of our new Saturday night tradition, Earshot Jazz Live from the Forum, this time featuring the Thomas Marriott Quartet. Meanwhile, you'll also find many past events available in our digital media library. It's kind of a memory hole now for life as it used to be, you know, back in February. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Arts and culture, in particular, is courtesy of For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, and the Wincote Foundation Northwest. But finally, as most of you know, Town Hall is fundamentally a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight's program. On that note, Town Hall, like other nonprofits, is feeling significant strain due to the canceled events in the wake of COVID-19. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time through a donation using the donate button at the bottom of your screen or by becoming a member over on the website. You can also text the words Town Hall to 44321 to give. Also, our partner booksellers are reeling a bit right now as well. And since I sincerely expect you'll want to learn more about Lucia after tonight's talk, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase your copy of The Joyce Girl through the Third Place Books webpage. All right, then. Annabel Abbs writes powerful stories about remarkable women. Her award-winning novel, Frida, the original Lady Chatterley, was published in 2018 and immediately became a Times of London, that is, Book of the Month, and then a Times Book of the Year. The novel tells the dramatic story of Frida von Richthofen, the woman who inspired D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley and later became his wife. Her recently completed third novel tells the story of Eliza Acton, Britain's first domestic goddess and cookbook writer, by description a sort of a proto-Nigella Lawson. Her first nonfiction book, The Age Well Project, is was out in 2019, co-written with Susan Crook Saunders and based on their acclaimed blog, agewellproject.com. It explores the science of longevity. Explores the science of longevity and incorporating healthy living into our busy lives. Returning to the topic of remarkable women, the subject of tonight's talk is her debut novel, The Joyce Girl, published in the UK in 2015 and just now being released in the States. It won numerous awards at the time for debut writing, was a reader pick in The Guardian for 2016, as one of the 10 books selected for presentation at the 2017 Berlin Film Festival. It's currently being adapted for the stage. So we may be late in discovering it in published form, but at least we'll beat the West End. Please join me in welcoming Annabel Abbs.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for tuning in. It is the middle of the night in London. I'm normally asleep at this time, but I've had a large cup of coffee, so I hope that I will keep going as per normal. And in fact, today I was thinking about Paris. I was thinking about, this great cauldron of creativity that we know as Jazz Age Paris, 1920s Paris. And, it really struck me that that cauldron of creativity was really predicated on people going out. And this sort of made me laugh because, we're all here, we're in lockdown. Certainly in London, everyone is locked down. We can go out for a bit of exercise, but everything is closed. Shops are closed, libraries, bookshops, galleries, restaurants, everything. So that is so completely different from Paris in the 1920s. And in Paris then, people really didn't spend much time at home. They lived in very small apartments with usually no gardens or balconies. Their apartments were cold. They had no central heating. They often had no running water, even maybe a shared tap. So everybody went out. They went to the jazz bars. They went to the nightclubs. They ate in brasseries and cafes. They walked the streets. They walked the parks. People worked in cafes. there were all these incredible chance encounters. I was reading today actually how Lee Miller, the photographer, she just met Man Ray. She just met him by going into a cafe, and they started talking. So all of these encounters really that we are not able to have at the moment, but we can live vicariously. And for the next half hour, we are going to live in 1920s Paris, and we are going to imagine what it was like to be there. And we're going to hope that one day we can go back there. So I thought I'd talk first of all a bit about Lucia Joyce and the Joyce family, just to give some context. And then I will talk about how I came across her and how I went through this very tortuous process of building this book. Because at the time I was not a writer, and I had never done a writing course of any sort, not even a half hour online. I'd done nothing. My parents were writers, and I'd always sworn that I would never be a writer. So I approached it in quite an unusual way. And it was a bit of a shock actually when it sort of became published and then became translated and then sort of went global. And I still can't quite believe it. But I think that is not down to me. It's really down to Lucia Joyce and the extraordinary story that that she is the center of. So I'll just explain who she is for those of you that don't know anything about her. She was certainly in 1920s Paris. She was a dancer. She was a very talented dancer. She learned to dance with Isadora Duncan's brother, Raymond Duncan, and Isadora Duncan's sister, Elizabeth Duncan. All three Duncan siblings were all these incredible dancers. And this was the tail end of Isadora Duncan, and she had just really transformed dance. She had turned dance into something that was much more free-form, much more, often barefoot. They didn't wear very much, often wearing these sort of very flimsy, diaphanous little tunics. And this was really quite radical and quite shocking. And in fact, Paris is really the center of dance. And we always think of Paris as being the center at this time for literature. We think of Hemingway, we think of Fitzgerald, we think of art, we think of Picasso and the surrealists and the cubists and all the other ists. And of course, we think of Stravinsky, and we think of jazz, we think of music. We think far less about dance, but in fact, Paris was a melting pot of all types of dance, from ballet russe, who were completely shaking up ballet and turning ballet into something much less conventional. And then there were ballet companies. The Swedish Ballet Company came to Paris, and they were doing really extraordinary things. They were integrating folk dance with ballet and with jazz, so with jazz dance. So it was a very exciting time to be a dancer. And Lucia Joyce got involved with a dance troupe, and they toured in Italy, they toured in Belgium, and she danced on many of the great stages of Paris. And during this time, she really becomes quite an exceptional dancer, and she's recorded as a newspaper report, one of the few things left, a newspaper report where she's interviewed, and the journalist who's writing the piece says, one day we won't know who James Joyce is, but we will know Lucia Joyce. And in fact, we might know James Joyce, but only as Lucia Joyce's father. Obviously, that isn't what happened, and we know Lucia Joyce as the daughter of James Joyce. I'm going to assume that most people will know that James Joyce was an Irish writer, one of the great modernist writers, possibly the greatest, who really changed the trajectory of literature. He really changed the shape of the novel, really, with his two. I'll do a bit of show and tell here. Ulysses was perhaps his best known book, and at the time that they're in Paris, Ulysses is banned in most of the world, and there's a big court case going on in the States where it's being sued effectively for being obscene. So at this time, James Joyce is known as a pornographer, as someone who's writing sort of rather dirty and lewd and incomprehensible books. The second book that he is known for is Finnegan's Wake. I don't know if you can see that, Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake took him 17 years to write, and it's the book that he was writing throughout what I will call Lucia's rise and fall. So from from when she starts learning to dance, when she becomes a well-known dancer. She also dances in a film that actually you can see on YouTube, and then her decline when she gives up dance. And that sense of her as a dancer is woven all the way through Finnegan's Wake. So that is who Lucia is, and that is who James is. And she also has a brother called Giorgio who becomes an opera singer, and she has a mother, Nora Barnacle. Nora Barnacle eloped with James Joyce from very Catholic. They both came from these deeply Catholic families, and they eloped from Dublin, in which was really quite a very a sort of quite bold move for Nora. That wasn't really what a good Catholic girl did. She didn't run away unmarried with another man. Now they're a very interesting couple, Nora and James, because James is very, very well educated and very erudite and really very intellectual. You know, some of his books really are books of ideas. But Nora is a chambermaid, and they meet on a street in Dublin, and James is immediately smitten with Nora. But Nora is not at all educated, and she never shows any interest in his work. And in fact, she didn't really show very much interest in Lucia's dance either. So it's a very interesting family. There's some very interesting relationships going on in this family, and Lucia has a brother, Giorgio, and Giorgio and Nora are very, very close from birth. The two of them are very, very close. So you've got these two very interesting relationships. You've got the father-daughter relationship, James and Lucia. They are very close and become much, much closer. And then you've got Nora and Giorgio, who are very, very close. And the families sort of separate along these two lines, which is also slightly interesting. So that gives you a quick overview of them, and I'm going to go back and talk about how I stumbled across her and why I felt completely impelled to write about her, how she got under my skin in this rather surprising and dramatic way. So I had a very normal job. My parents being writers, I'd sworn never to be a writer, and I had gone to work in technology actually, and I was working. Writing articles about row-level locking in the Oracle database and other such things. I worked for a consultancy that launched Apple in the UK and Dell and other technology companies. It's a very long time ago. This is in the 80s and the 90s. And I left that, and I had these 4 small children that I needed to spend more time with. And I started casting around for something to do, and I definitely didn't want to be a writer. So I went off to photography school, and I thought I'd be a photographer. But of course, I was a really terrible photographer, and I quickly realized that I was not going to be a photographer. And then I started making flavored vodka, and that is also a very bad thing to do if you're stuck at home in your kitchen with 4 small children. You shouldn't really have vodka around. So the vodka went, and then I was sort of at a bit of a loss. I needed something to do, and a friend of mine suggested that I read a graphic novel for my book group, and I've got it here. This graphic novel changed my life entirely. At the time, being a literary person, I was slightly snooty about a graphic novel. I thought, oh no, you know, I'm more of a War and Peace girl. But this graphic novel tells the story of the author, a woman called Mary Talbot. Now, Mary Talbot's father was a Joycean scholar, and this is really her sort of autobiography. A story of what it was like to have a father who's a Joycean scholar. But through her own story, she weaves the story of Lucia Joyce. And I'm rather embarrassed to say I had never heard of Lucia Joyce before. I had studied Joyce at university, but I had no idea he had this daughter. And this was part of the mystery. I knew he had a son, and Giorgio. I knew he had this famous wife, Nora Barnacle, but I knew nothing about Lucia. And initially I read this book and I thought, gosh, daughter I've never knew about, you know, she sounds so interesting. What a fantastic life. You know, what did she do in jazz age Paris? You know, and of course I knew from the book that Hemingway was regularly going there, and that, you know, she had danced for a bit with Scott Fitzgerald's wife Zelda, and, you know, all these sort of famous people, these well-known names are sort of obviously in her life. And I started digging around, and I found out that there was actually a biography of Lucia, and it's here, written by another Joycean, actually written by a Joycean professor, Carol Schloss. And this book really got me going. So I was really excited to find this biography. I took it on holiday. I read it all the way through, and then I read it all the way through again because I was left with a fairly good understanding of, I suppose, the scaffolding of Lucia's life. So I could see that, you know, she was born on this day, and then she'd gone to this school, and then she'd moved this house and that house and this house, a lot of houses, I'll come back to that, and then this school, and then she'd trained here and trained there. But there was no sense of Lucia at all. She was sort of voiceless. And this is not the biographer's fault at all. It was because, as I realized, everything to do with Lucia had been destroyed. So all her letters had gone, her diaries had been destroyed, her journals. She was alleged to have written a novel that had gone. She had seen, over the course of her mental illness, which I will come back to, she had seen hundreds, well, not quite hundreds, but she'd seen tens of doctors. Not a single medical note was left. She had spent 4 months in psychoanalysis with Carl Jung. Carl Jung had destroyed all his notes from all those sessions 3 times a week for 4 months. He'd got rid of the whole lot. So it was a bit like looking for someone, looking in this big black hole and not really seeing anyone at the bottom of it. There were a few photographs, quite a few photographs of her. I spent a lot of time looking at the photographs. And then, of course, I started trying to find her in Joyce's work. And I did find sort of bits of her, versions of her. And then every now and then, you know, I started pouring through every letter that Samuel Beckett had written. She was alleged to have an affair with Beckett, and she was deeply in love with Samuel Beckett. And the same with Alexander Calder. And I just started reading almost everything I could find written by someone who had come into contact with the Joyce family. And over a period of about 4 years, I started to put together a picture of Lucia. I had to do lots of other things. I had to travel to the 120 houses that she lived in before she was 22. So that took quite a lot of time as I traipsed around with my 4 children, persuading them that we had to have a holiday in Trieste and we had to go to Paris again. In fact, I came up with what I thought was quite a clever move. I put them all into these exchange programs in Paris. So I kept having to go over to Paris on the Eurostar to drop them off with these lovely French families where they would spend a week, and then I'd have to go back again to collect them. And each time I went to and from Paris, I would go and do a few more of Lucia's walks. I would find the walk that she had taken from, this particular house to that dance school, or this particular house or hotel where they stayed to that other dance school. And in this way, I started to put her together. So these 120 houses that the Joyce family had lived in before she was 22 was also a sort of a revelation to me, because I couldn't help feeling, but the moving 120 times would be very, very disruptive. I'd moved quite a lot as a child myself, and each of those moves I can still remember so clearly. Each time going to a new school, I can remember it so clearly. And so I started thinking about that quite a lot. And I was one particular occasion, I went to Trieste, and I was going around all the houses they had lived in Trieste. And Trieste now is a beautiful little, very small, quiet city, and the sort of back end of Italy. But when they were there, Trieste was a huge port, and it was full of ships coming and going. It was full of sailors. And I located one of the flats that they had lived in for quite a long time, 2 or 3 years, actually, one of the longest periods they'd lived anywhere. And I located the bedrooms and where they had lived. And then I went to the local museum and spoke to the curator. And he said, well, you need to know that street where Lucia Joyce was probably looking out of the window all the time, that street, tiny little narrow street, that street was the red light district of Trieste. And her flat looked straight into, the most boisterous brothel of all. And he said that street would have been crowded with sailors and prostitutes, and there would have been violence and drunkenness. It's not like the street you're looking at now. So all of these sort of little epiphanies went into my attempt to try and resurrect who I thought she might have been, and the sort of person, the things that made her, if you like. And I always refer to this as not a book. I wasn't writing a book. I was sort of just building this manuscript, really. And again, not intentionally, I didn't set out to write a book. Having read the biography, I thought, I want to know more about Lucia. I wanted to know about her inner life. I particularly wanted to know, what was it like to be the daughter of this pornographer? And what we have to remember about James Joyce then is that, he was a rock star in Paris. People would come up to him in restaurants and bars and ask for his autograph. It's not like being a writer today. No one knows who you are, no one cares. Then writers, the great writers, were these sort of stars. But he was also this famous pornographer. So I wanted to know, what was it like? What was it like to have him as your father? What was it like to have an affair with this very young Samuel Beckett? What happened between them? And of course, Alexander Calder became her drawing teacher. And she also alleged later on in the mental asylum, where she spent the last sort of 50 years of her life, she spent a lot of time talking about the people she should have married. And she always mentioned Samuel Beckett, and she always mentioned Alexander Calder. And yet, because she was languishing in this mental asylum, no one really believed what she said. She wasn't seen as a credible witness. But I decided I was going to believe her. And if for 20 years while she was in this mental asylum, and I'm not sure if I've mentioned that she spent the last 50 years of her life in a series of asylums, and the last 30 years in this English asylum. And I thought, if that's what she's saying, for 30 years she's maintaining that she had these affairs and she was supposed to marry these men. I thought, well, I'm gonna believe her. Oh, why would I not? Meanwhile, the people that she was alleged to have had the affairs with, like Samuel Beckett and Alexander Calder, never mentioned a word, never said anything. So one of the problems as a biographer is that you couldn't really write these. You couldn't really write these chunks of her life because there was nothing that could be footnoted. There was no source material, and if people don't talk, then there's nothing to go on. Samuel Beckett, he went to work for James Joyce, and he worked for Joyce for a couple of years, and it was during this period that the two of them apparently developed this affair, and she fell very, very, very deeply in love with him. And I managed to find a few little accounts of them being seen together in restaurants and things. She then spent this 50 years in a series of asylums, the last 30 years in this English asylum, where she was completely forgotten. Now, the thing about England is she had never lived there. She had no friends or family in England. So once she was put there, she was completely forgotten about until, and this must have been about 1980, 1981, just before she died, an English writer went to this asylum to interview another woman that was there, the woman who attempted to shoot Mussolini. So this English writer was writing a book about the woman who tried to shoot Mussolini, and she went to interview her in the asylum, and it was pointed out to her that James Joyce's daughter was sitting in the corner. And of course she was like, James Joyce's daughter? James Joyce had a daughter. And she came out of the asylum, with all her material to write about the woman who shot Mussolini, and she ended up writing an article about her extraordinary discovery of James Joyce's daughter, just completely forgotten in this mental hospital. So that was when the public here started to find out that there was this daughter, and she was still alive, and she was in Northamptonshire, sort of locked up in this big old house, where sadly she died. So what I wanted to understand was, I wanted to understand how she had gone from being this incredibly talented, successful, aspiring dancer, dancing on Paris stages, to how she had then ended up dying forgotten in an asylum. And that scenario is particularly poignant because of the careers of all the men in her life. So if you look at people like Samuel Beckett, I'm sure you'll recognize his wizened, rugged old face, one of the greatest playwrights of the 20th century. Carl Jung went on to be, again, one of the great pioneers of psychoanalysis and how we understand the unconscious. He worked very closely with Freud for many years, and he's now this sort of big, iconic figure. Alexander Calder, again, the inventor of the mobile, also huge, famous, illustrious, iconic male. And then of course there's James Joyce, and I thought, this is juxtaposition, I found it very unsettling. And so I thought, I've got to try and give her a voice. I've got to try and put her back on the stage where she had sort of been pushed off, really. So I did a lot of walking around from all these different houses that she'd lived in. I read through all of Joyce's works repeatedly, looking for bits of her and finding bits of her. And in fact, later on in life, someone in Paris says to her at some stage, he's talking about Finnegan's Wake. He says, oh, are you in your dad's book? And Lucia Joyce says, yes. When anything about love or madness or dance, that's about me. And so I found quite a lot of her in there. I also found her in dance. I'd done ballet as a child, but I wanted to understand how she felt as a modern dancer. So I learned to dance in the style that she did, which I've talked about the Duncans, but the real style she then went on to work closely with was something called the Margaret Morris method. And I discovered a Margaret Morris teacher in London, and she ran a little class, which I went along to, and everyone in this class was about 90. And I joined it. And in that series of dance classes, I had a series of my own sort of, I suppose, catalyzing moments, my own epiphanies, where I suddenly started to understand how dance for Lucia, it was her voice, it was the way she spoke, it was how she communicated. And she had very cleverly found a way of self-expression that didn't really tread on the toes of her singing, her musical brother, or her obviously literary father. And I always think that Joyce obviously spoke through words, and language was his language, if you like. And Giorgio spoke through music. And in fact, later Giorgio became an alcoholic, so you could say possibly he spoke through alcohol. But for her, she chose dance, and she must have known that dance was not something that either James Joyce or Giorgio could muscle in on. It was entirely hers. And when I learned to dance in this style, it's quite a strange style. A lot of it is quite disciplined and similar to ballet, and it's very, very precise movements, which I was absolutely hopeless at. But every lesson, halfway through the lesson, after I've been grappling with these very, very difficult series of foot movements. All the other women had been doing this for years and years. They were brilliant, but I was hopeless. Halfway through, the dance teacher would suddenly say, be a bird, or be a mermaid, or be a tree, and everyone would just go completely freeform. They would just do whatever they wanted to do. It was completely improvised. And I'm obviously a buttoned up English person. I found this quite hard at first, but I thought, I'm just going to go for it. So when I just went for it, and when I was just being a bird or a mermaid, I had this amazing understanding, I felt, into Lucia and the freedom that she must have found in dance. Because having looked at all these little houses and places they lived in tiny, tiny places. And she shared a bedroom until she was 18 with her parents, tiny little bedrooms, all of them cramped in together. And for her, I think that dancing really was the way that she spoke. And again, I think the poignancy for me of seeing her there, hearing about her then being put into things like straitjackets, being confined in these little rooms, barred rooms, locked in. So she was frequently straitjacketed or put into these cold baths, put into these special horrible gloves they used to put the patients into in these mental hospitals, was particularly distressing, because I really do think the worst thing you can do to a dancer, to someone who uses their body to I guess to explain how they're feeling, the worst thing you could probably do is to put them in a straitjacket and to lock them up. So I was very, very, very struck by the pathos of her situation and her predicament. So I danced, I read, I walked and walked and walked from house to house with all my little children in tow, and I churned through whatever I could. I actually felt, the book is written in the first person, and I'm not going to tell you about some of the things I found, and also I'm not going to tell you how she ended up in the asylum, because that's sort of part of the story, and that would really ruin it. So I'll keep that quiet. But I did find her the most difficult character of all to try and piece together, because the thing about writing this sort of historical fiction or biographical fiction is that, you know, you're working with real people. So it's not, you don't have that great freedom of writing just pure fiction, and that you can just create a character, you can just invent a character, you know, you can just make them whatever you like. I didn't have that luxury with Lucia. I knew I was working with a real person. And with all the other characters, say with our old, our beloved Beckett. Now, Beckett has about 10 biographies. And as you can see, you know, they're huge, they're huge. So after I churned through all his biographies, read through all his collected letters, numerous interviews with him, because of course he's very famous and celebrated, been to see every single one of his plays, read everything he had written, I felt I knew him really well. I thought, you know, I've got Beckett. You know, that's straightforward. And the same with James, and the same with Nora, and the same with Alexander Corday, and the same with Carl Jung. There was so much material. It was really very easy. But not easy because I didn't really know what I was doing. But it was fairly straightforward. They had clear known characters and character traits and characteristics that I could work with. But Lucia really did not have very much at all. So in that situation, obviously, I had to use quite a lot of my imagination, and I had to put quite a bit of myself in there, because, you know, that's all I know. So after about 3 or 4 years, I looked at this manuscript, which I sort of always talk about as having been built rather than written, because written I always think sounds rather nice. I imagine someone, you know, sitting at which is what I do now actually, sit at a desk, and you just sort of, you write or you do keyboard, and it flows. So this did not flow. I was doing scene by scene and bits and pieces. But because I had no intention of, I didn't think I was writing a book. I had no intention of trying to get it published. I was just doing it for myself. I had no expectations. And because I'd never done a writing course, I didn't really have anything in my head about what I should or shouldn't be doing. I didn't really have any writing friends saying, you know, how's it getting on? I didn't even tell my husband I was writing this book. I used to get up very early in the morning. I used to get up about 4 a.m. And I used to work I used to do 3 hours of writing, writing really. I did the reading later on. But I did sort of 3 hours of writing while my husband or all my children were asleep. And eventually, after about 2 years, my husband said, you know, you're getting up very early. You know, what are you doing? I've got no socks, and the house is a complete mess. And you know, what on earth are you doing? And I said, oh, I'm writing. And he was like, oh, right, okay. And I got to the stage where I started thinking, well, I've got this manuscript, and it was a bit of a mess. So I kept rewriting it and tinkering with it and rewriting it. And I had no publisher, I had no deadline, I had no agent, I didn't know what I was doing. So it was just like fun. And then I sort of found out there were writing competitions. I thought, oh well, I've got this book. Why don't I just send it off? And I started sending it off to writing competitions. I don't know what I was thinking. I was just thinking, well, I've spent years on this, and I sort of wanted Lucia's story to be out there. I felt it was a story worth telling. So I started sending it off into these writing competitions. And I don't know, I had some beginner's luck, and it kept being longlisted, and then shortlisted, and I tinkered a bit more. And then it won a competition, and the competition was publication. And then I had people wanting to be my agent, and this was all a bit of a shock. But I just sort of thought, right, you know, just go with it. And at the back of my mind, always, I had Lucia. I mean, she lived inside my head, and even she lives there now. It sounds kind of weird. She lives there now. And I think with these characters, they carry on living, and they carry on changing. She's different. She's different now from the Lucia that I originally wrote about. But anyway, she lived with me for several years. I mean, very, very sort of front of mind. And I was a bit like a ghost, a husk in my home. And then since then, it's been translated into 10 languages and sold all over the world. America is a bit late to the party, actually, because when it first came out in the UK, my agent tried to find an American publisher, and a couple were interested, but they said, you know, this ending, it won't be very popular here, because, you know, we like a really positive story, and this ending, you know, can you change it? And I had to say, I can't change the ending. I can't change the ending. You know, she died in an asylum. It's a sad story, but there's a lot of you know, a lot of sort of upside really in terms of her legacy, which we can talk about very quickly if we've got time. And so then I sort of forgot about ever being published in America. I thought, okay, you know, it's clearly never going to be published. And then suddenly it just got picked up by the wonderful William Morrow, to whom I am eternally grateful. And obviously I'm thrilled now. I'm really thrilled that I can bring Lucia a little bit further out of her her dark, cobwebby closet, because I think she deserves a voice, and I still feel very strongly, and it's sort of very pertinent now, I think, to look at how in the past voices have been silenced, and her voice was completely silenced. And this idea that if someone has had a breakdown, if someone goes into asylum, then everything they say after that is not believable, is not usable, is not credible. I still find shocking. Fortunately, we don't have mental asylums like that. Unfortunately, we don't treat people in the way that Lucia was treated. So we have made enormous progress. And just to say very briefly before I open it up to questions, that what happened after I wrote the story of Lucia is actually several books, 2 more books have come out about Lucia since then, and also I got inundated with letters and emails and things from people, artists who wanted to paint her. People used to send me very strange questions like, do you know what color eyes what color eyes she had? And of course all the photographs are in black and white, so I didn't really know what color eyes she had. I had to do a lot of working, reading and working out, and eventually I found out what color her eyes were, beg your pardon. But there was this sort of deluge, if you like, of interest in her as almost as a creative muse. She's inspired dances and plays and musical compositions and portraits and books. So I hope that she would feel that her life was worth something in the end. And I think shall I end it there?
I'm going to ask some questions, so we'll keep it. We'll keep the party going for a little bit. Thank you, Annabel. I'll just start with this. Why do you think, and demur if you must, but why do you think the sudden interest in someone who, in many ways, had been kind of lost to history? Since your own book, you indicate a few other publications, and what do you think? What do you attribute that to?
Yes, it's odd, really, isn't it? Because I think there's actually more interest in Lucia Joyce now, possibly, than James Joyce. Although obviously he's still very big on the scholarly curriculum. I think the huge wave of mental illness, and it's certainly quite huge over here. And as a mother of teenagers, I see that. I think that has triggered an interest in her and in what happened to her. And I think also there's just much more interest now in some of the female characters who could have been something, who could have been like their more illustrious male counterparts and were deprived of that. And I think that's quite an important lesson for us too. That the people who didn't manage to achieve things are just as important, and often they're important because they didn't manage to achieve them, because of the factors that stopped them achieving things. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Being left out of the official account and sort of reclaiming those stories.
Reclaim those voices.
It seems like you've had an incredibly long history with this character, from deciding that you were curious to clandestinely sneaking away and writing your first book when you least expected you would, and not even telling your own family about it, and now it's released. It's had so many iterations, and now suddenly it's popping up in America, and there's the stage life. What does it feel like to stay with a character this rich and this, in some ways, kind of unfathomable for as long as you have, and as you've even tried to move on to writing about other things and thinking about other things? What does it feel like to live with Lucia for as many years as you have now?
I think she just feels like she's a little bit part of me, and it's possible that it's possible that she always was, in a way. If you see what I mean, does that make sense? That sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But yeah, I think I suppose when I look back, I think there were a lot of things that I felt had crushed her, that I felt I could understand. They resonated, and it was that sense of being the way in which she was, well, if you read the book, the way in which she was crushed was very, very subtle. It was very disingenuous. There was something slightly Machiavellian about it. No, people didn't actually come out and say, no, you can't dance. it was done much more subtly, and that very subtle silencing, I think it's sort of invidious, but it's right through society. And you just have to be able to recognize those voices telling you can't do things, and you don't always hear them for what they are. So I
Sure.
hope that makes sense. I mean, we
It
all
does.
have them. We all have those voices telling us that you can't do something, or you shouldn't do something, or you mustn't do something. Some have more voices than others, but we all have them, don't we?
Absolutely. Did you think you were going to be writing something different when you started, when you began the exploration? Did you think you were going to discover a different person than you ended up finding?
No, I had no idea. I had no idea who I
No
was going to
person.
discover. No, because there was nothing. I literally just had a few black and white photographs. I just knew that she was quite tall. She had dark hair. She was very slim, and she was this extraordinary dancer. So she was incredibly creative. This is her in one of her outfits. She used to design and make all her own amazing outfits. This is her mermaid outfit. She would choreograph her own dances. She would find the music. She did everything. She did everything. And it was, I'm still completely overwhelmed by what little she achieved, or what in the little amount of time she had, how much she achieved.
How much she achieved,
Yeah,
right?
how much she achieved in such a short time.
I'm trying to do, and maybe you said this, and forgive me if you did, I'm trying to reestablish a chronology, but if she was essentially institutionalized for 50 years, what were her productive years? How long was she dancing, and how long was she sort of outside of the institutional setting actually making work? Into her early 30s or late 20s?
About 5 years. Yeah, about 5 years. So
5 years.
she is sort of about 25. Yes, about 5 years. So from 19 to about 25 years. So she's about 25, if I remember correctly, when she has her first breakdown.
Right.
And she's institutionalized, maybe 5 years after that, until she dies in 1982.
So questions are starting to pop up. I'm going to pose one more before I go to the questions here. I also was struck by your description of the process of writing this book, which you characterized as sort of choppy and not having a lot of flow or grace. And juxtaposing that, maybe you didn't use the word grace, my apologies, but you did. But juxtaposing that with both her persona as a dancer, but also with Finnegan's Wake, which is frankly only flow, only sort of a continuous stream. And I just I wonder, what was it about the subject for you that made it so hard to write? Or was it more about yourself entering into sort of a self-identity as a writer, something that you had resisted, or something that you never sort of imagined for yourself that was its own impediment? Why do you think it was hard to feel that sense of momentum and flow?
Well, the first answer is that I did not know what I was doing. I had never written anything other than I used to write speeches for the chief executive of Oracle and people, but that was nothing, not at all creative at all. So I hadn't written anything creative. So I just literally did not know what I was doing, but I'd read a lot. That was my saving grace. And the second reason was that the story, it was a very ambitious story. I mean, if I was a normal writer, I would never ever choose that subject. I would never choose something as difficult. The complexity for me of having to read all of that, having to get to grips with the entire oeuvre of Beckett and Joyce and Jung and all these other people. I mean, I just read and read and read and read. And so it was just, I mean, no normal sensible writer would choose that as a book, let alone a first book. So, but because I wasn't writing a book, I didn't think like that. So it was both impediment and opportunity at the same time.
Right. It sounds like you were caught between knowing entirely too much and nothing at all.
Yeah.
About the subject, right? Like and knowing entirely too much about all of these ironically peripheral figures to the figure you're trying to chase, right?
Yes.
And they're documented to within an inch of their lives, and she's shadows in all of this other rich history. right?
Absolutely. She is a shadow in all of their lives. So it was like unpicking her shadow from their very big dominant shadows.
Right. I'm gonna stop talking and get to a couple of other questions. Susie wants to know, what sorts of places did she dance while she was in Paris? What kinds of venues?
Oh, she danced in the Theatre des Champs-Élysées,
Hmm.
which is quite a big one. But she also danced in some smaller theatres that don't exist now. So a lot of them were small, fairly small theatres where they would have cabaret, and she would go and do her troupe would dance for one evening, and then there'll be something the next night and something the next night, because this is 1920s Paris and everything is sort of all mixed up. So she didn't do anything like the Paris Opera House.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'm not sure she would anyway, because a lot of this modern dance was taking place in the smaller, more avant-garde theatres. So, but the Theatre des Champs-Élysées was one of the big ones where she danced, and she danced in the Bal Bollier.
And was she a soloist and also dancing in the context of an ensemble, or like?
Yeah, so
sometimes
she danced with her troupe. They were called Les Six de Rhythm et Couleur, the six of rhythm and color. And there were 6 of them, and they were the ones that toured around Italy and Belgium. And then sometimes she danced on her own. So if she was dancing in a competition, she would dance solo. So a bit of both.
Got it.
Yeah.
Lisa wants to know, what do you believe was Lucia's greatest characteristic or strength, and was that what drew her to you?
What was her
greatest characteristic or strength?
Yeah, I think she had absolute integrity. She was very kind, and I think in some ways her kindness and her loyalty to her father was her downfall. She was so concerned about him. She did not want to distract him with her dancing. She did not want to. So quite often she has to dance in his study, because they're in these tiny flats. She has to dance while he's working, and he can only work with the curtains closed because he's got bad eyes. So it's a very, very strange family, full of the remarkable anecdotes. So quite often she's dancing in the pitch black while he's working in this tiny study. And I think that she didn't. Another important thing is that Nora. I always felt Nora was quite shamed by Lucia's dancing. She thought dancing was not what nice girls did. And if you were in Ireland, you never danced on stage with bare feet and a little tunic. That was what the devil did. So Nora was always shamed by that. So I think, and Lucia seemed to be very, very sensitive. She was very, very aware of other people and what they thought and what they felt and how she was impacting on them, to such an extent that she was uncomfortable putting herself out there, which, as a dancer, a career dancer, you've got to put your career first. So she ended up always putting herself back. And so was that her greatest strength? So it was her downfall, but it was something that endeared her to me because she was so kind and so loyal. But she was very, very creative, and I was very, very struck by her creativity, by the making of these costumes, the designing of them, the way she put everything together. I thought it was fantastic.
Wow. I'm just gonna mention, and I have to confess, I stepped away for not very long, about 60 seconds. But someone wants to is grateful that you mentioned "Daughter of Her Father's Eyes" by Mary Talbot.
Yes, that's right.
And the comment is just that she found it about 5 years ago, and that she appreciated your mentioning the value of graphic literature and how important it is to people with aphantasia, that they can finally enjoy reading through accessing it visually like that. So she appreciated your mentioning of Mary Talbot.
I love graphic novels now. Having been a snob beforehand, after I read Daughter, I was a complete convert, and I went out and bought loads of graphic novels, and they're brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. There's one about James Joyce as well, a graphic novel all about him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I recommend it. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a graphic novel about James Joyce. You'll find it. Yeah.
I'll hunt both of them.
It's written by an Italian guy. Well, written and drawn by an Italian guy. Yeah. Yeah. No, they're brilliant. Right. I love them.
And then a different Barbara, I think, poses the question: do you have anything you can share from your own book that describes her dancing? Is there a passage that you can think of that
Oh
that
yes, yes,
characterizes
yes.
her dance?
There's quite a lot of passages of her dancing, which I was able to write after I had all these dancing lessons. Before that, I couldn't get my head around it really. But after I did all the dancing lessons, I felt not qualified. I don't feel qualified. I felt confident enough to write about her dancing. And in fact, I absolutely loved writing about her dancing. Yeah, it's very, very liberating for some reason to write about someone dancing, because actually I loved it, but I also found it really difficult because I worked out that there aren't really very many words for dance. So there are only so many times you can use the same, the same words, swirl and twirl and whatever. So the vocabulary of dance is very constrained, and they're just it's a rather restricted vocabulary. So I struggled with that, but I did love those scenes, writing the scenes. Yeah, there are several in the book.
Would I put you on the spot to ask you to, if you've got a copy of the book at hand, to read a little bit or not? Is that
Oh,
too
sure.
much to ask?
Do you want to?
Only if I can jump in for a moment while you find something.
Do you want anything, or do you want to dancey?
I was thinking something dancey, just since that's what Barbara
Yeah.
asked about. But
Okay, hang on.
if there's something else that you prefer, that would be fine too.
Well, I tell you what, there is a little scene here. Sorry, there's lots of pages. I don't want to waste everyone's time by going through these.
It's probably less of a waste than you think.
Okay. Okay, so she does dance a lot. And she talks to Beckett about her dance. And in fact, one of the few things he ever says about her is that she was a very talented dancer. Okay, here's a little bit. There's a little bit here where she's waiting. She's waiting to meet up with Samuel Beckett, who she's falling very passionately in love with. And while she waits, she starts thinking about a dance. It was while I waited for tea with Beckett that a dance began to form in my mind's eye, a sequence of movements based on a sapling and a plane tree. As I walked through the Jardin du Luxembourg, I looked closely at the swaying boughs and the trembling leaves. I watched the scudding of the clouds and the way rain spattered on the boating lake. I found an old chestnut tree and stroked its warped bark. How could I turn the solidity of an ancient tree into dance? When I passed the Seine, that's the river in front of Paris, I noted the ebb and flow of the water. That too would be part of my choreography. As soon as I got home, I took notes and made quick sketches of what I'd seen. I wanted to incorporate ballet, eurythmics, flamenco, and jazz. I wondered if Mrs. Fitzgerald might like to dance it with me, or perhaps Kitten. And could I ask Emile to compose a score for me? Although I was undecided about who was to dance and who was to compose the music, my mind was resolutely made up as to how the dance would end. The sapling must die. I had an image of the grand finale as a slow dance of death, leaving the sapling prostrate and motionless, while the plane tree remained triumphantly upright. And yet I didn't envisage this as a battle played out in movement. It was to be a slow struggle where nothing was obvious until the end. Would it work? Could I do it? So that's just a scene where she's thinking about dance in her head, because she danced all day. I mean, she danced 6-8 hours every single day. So I assumed she was probably thinking about it all the time when she wasn't dancing.
Of course. Would she have identified as a choreographer as well in that time, or would?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. Choreographer, costume designer.
Within the ensemble, was she, or was how much do you know about the group?
Oh, in the dance troupe, there were two sort of senior dancers. So she left the troupe when she did more solo work, but when she's in the troupe, she's one of the 6. But there are 2 who lead the troupe, who are absolutely incredible dancers.
Fantastic. Well, that was actually beautiful. I'm glad you didn't waste our time at all. I'm glad you found that passage. It was gorgeous.
Okay, well, there are dancing scenes too, but
no, it was really perfect. I'll just ask one more question, and then I will note that looks like Candace has found, if you're listening, has found the Joyce graphic novel. So you can click after you've purchased the Joyce Girl. You can click through and check that out. Once you felt, as you got further into your, just going back for a moment to the process of writing the book, the further you got into the subject, and perhaps the more clarity you had about the vantage you were writing from, and finding that first person voice and understanding her more, was there a moment when you felt like you sort of could drop into the character, where it was less challenging to write, less like synthesizing too much information, and sort of, was there a moment when you felt like you actually sort of like dropped into her and were able to write with that kind of confidence?
I used to drop into her, to use your phrase, the minute I woke up. So I would wake up in the morning, and literally I'd have about maybe 2 minutes before I was fully awake, and in that 2 minutes I dropped into her, to use your phrase. And then she would go, but I'd have to hang on to that. There's something about that strange liminal time, isn't there, but when you're not awake and you're not asleep. Sure. When something happens inside the creative brain, inside the imagination, something happens. I don't understand how it works, but those were my moments of clarity, and that was it. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, or sometimes it was 1 minute. Yeah. And then I had to just hang on to it all day.
I'd be desperate. Excuse me, I got to get my pad. But so when you're writing in the first person, it's not occurred to me to ask this before. When you're writing in the first person, can you move through space and see your character outside of you, or is it entirely about sort of being sensorily present as the character? You know what I'm saying? Like, was it possible, the deeper you went into it, was it possible to have that kind of authorial distance, or did you get it done by sort of assuming the role, if that makes any sense at all?
No, the latter, really. The latter. She was always sort of inside she was always internal rather than external. The other characters I could see quite clearly, and they were external.
Right.
But she was sort of floating around, coming and going. She was like, it's a bit like living with a ghost, you know? If you've had that experience.
I haven't, but I'm imagining, I'm projecting.
Yeah, imagine this sort of ghost that comes and goes. But sometimes I did feel that that she was coming to me in these short little moments. Not for a reason, because that sounds slightly weird. But I sort of thought there was some reason why this was happening, and I wondered if she was speaking to me. That sounds absolutely bonkers.
No, it doesn't. No, and she's speaking through you. I mean, that very project that you started out with to find a way to resurrect her voice or channel her voice that had not been heard and had been lost for so many decades. I mean, through 5 years now of having sort of brought her back into general consciousness, perhaps I don't think it's crazy at all to suggest that, okay, I'm about to sound like it, but to suggest that somehow her story needed to be told, and she found a way for it to be told through you, right? I don't know.
Maybe, yeah, or maybe it was just a part of me speaking out. We'll never know. We don't know how the unconscious works, do we? But
that's more likely.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, by the way, for staying up late with us and for sharing your passion for this subject with us, and for this forgotten woman, and bringing her back to life so vividly. And I encourage everyone who's watched and listened tonight to pick up your own copy using the conveniently green button at the bottom center of the screen, and we'll all spread the word about this book as it's finding voice here in the United States. Annabel, thank you so much. And
thank you all.
And once we've collapsed this time between your European release and the American release, we'll see you again much sooner for your next book. Okay.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Good night. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.